Hey guys, this is Brother Scott with the Potter's House, and this is part 4 of our Fingerprints of Yahweh video series. In the first 3, we laid a foundation for this series. In the third video, we began to look at the feast days of God. Now let me go back for a minute. We get the Fingerprints of Yahweh title from Genesis 1:14. The word signs, the Greek word they use there in the Septuagint for the word signs, also means finger marks of Yahweh. So we have entitled this Fingerprints of Yahweh, and it kind of ties in with everything. And our last video that we did, we were looking at Leviticus 23 as we begin to look at these fingerprints of Yahweh. And how that these are his times, his appointed times, his feast days, not the Jewish things that most of churchianity says that they're Jewish, they belong to the Jewish people. If you keep the Sabbath, if you do these feast days, then you're just trying to be Jewish. And so, but when you study it out, these actually do, through Scripture, point to be the things that belong to God, to Yahweh. It's very much there. But we were looking at the Sabbath in part 3, and we said in part 3 that we would do 2 videos on the Sabbath. And so this is that second one. And if we go to Genesis 2, Genesis chapter 2, in verse 2, we're going to see that here again, unlike most of churchianity, that say that the Sabbath was given at Mount Sinai, we found that it was given long before Mount Sinai. In Genesis 2:2 it says, "On the 7th day Yahweh ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had made. And Yahweh blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which Yahweh created and made." So here we see that this was indeed established long before the commandments were given. But let's go to Exodus 20, and the wording here is going to prove that fact, that the Sabbath was established long before Mount Sinai. Verse 8, the first word, gives us this indication. And it says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy." And then verses 9 and 10 and on down to 11 gives us kind of the instructions on how to remember it, how to keep it holy. So let's go to Leviticus 23, and we're just going to look at this again as we get into this. And we covered this in video 3, so we're not going to rehash everything that we did in video 3, but it says, starting at verse 1 of Leviticus 23, it says, "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and saying to them concerning the feast of Yahweh, which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my feast." Verse 3, 6 days shall work be done, but the 7th is the Sabbath of rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work therein. It is the Sabbath of Yahweh in all your dwellings. So we can look at that, or people look at that, and they can say, well, here again, this was just for the Jewish people, or just for, and they're going to say Jewish people, but there, in Leviticus it says the children of Israel. And we talked a little bit in the last video how that if you were born again believer, you have the Spirit dwelling in you, that the Apostle Paul says that you've been grafted in. He says that we have been adopted. And we looked at that term adoption or adopted in the last video a little bit. But let's look in Isaiah 58 and verse 13 and see what Yahweh says about the Sabbath. He says, if thou turn away thy foot from the Sabbath, from doing thy pleasure on my holy days, on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of Yahweh, honorable, and shalt honor him, not doing thine own ways, nor finding thine own pleasure, nor speaking thine own words, then shalt thou delight thyself in Yahweh, and I will cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed thee in the heritage of Jacob thy father, for the mouth of Yahweh hath spoken it. So here again, we are admonished in Isaiah by Yahweh to keep the Sabbath. Now, you may also be told that it's just a Old Testament thing, and it's not for what many will say New Covenant believers. Well, let's look in the New Covenant part of the book, what many call the New Testament, the New Covenant part, and because they feel that things, everything flip-flopped. Let's see if Yeshua kept the Sabbath. Let's go to Luke chapter 6, or Mark chapter 6. And this is speaking of Yeshua, says in verse 2, and when the Sabbath day was come, he began to teach in the synagogue. And many hearing him were astonished, saying, from whence hath this man these things, and what wisdom is this is given unto him, that even such mighty works are wrought by his hands? So here we have an example of Yeshua keeping the Sabbath. Let's go to Luke chapter 6 and verse 6. It says, and it came to pass on another Sabbath that he entered into the synagogue and taught. So here again we see Yeshua keeping the Sabbath, and he is our example. We're to follow the example that he set. So let's go to the book of Acts and look at a couple of verses. Now, according to much of churchianity, after Acts 2, when the Spirit fell at the temple, then everything really flip-flopped. Everything really changed. So let's go to Acts 13 and read verse 14. This is speaking of Paul. Paul is the one that is accredited with pretty much, I've heard people say he started a new religion, which is not true. And they say, that Yeshua and Paul started a new religion, and we just don't see that anywhere in the book. If you're interested in learning a little bit more Paul's teachings and stuff, you can go to our website, our YouTube channel, and we had done some teaching on the book of Galatians, and we're currently teaching on the book of Romans, understanding what Paul was saying. But anyway, verse 14 says, and when they departed from Perga, they came to Antioch in Pisidia, and went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and sat down. This is Paul and those that were traveling with him on the Sabbath day went to the synagogue. Now, I've heard one Christian teacher say that the reason that Paul went to the synagogue on the Sabbath was to bring the people out and take them to church on Sunday. And that would be a lie. There's nothing in the Bible that backs up that teaching, that's the reason that he went. That's just a lie. Let's go to verse 42 of Acts 13. And it says, when the Jews were gone out of the synagogue, the Gentiles besought that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath. So if notice here that the Gentiles didn't say, come back to us on Sunday, come back to us tomorrow, so we can hear more of these words. But they said, come back and we want to hear more of these words on the next Sabbath. So even the Gentiles, let's just call them here these God-fearers, because they were at the synagogue on the Sabbath. They weren't converts to Judaism, but they were God-fearers. They were Gentiles doing the things that that pleased Yahweh. Let's go to verse 44. Well, what happened? Verse 44 tells us, and the next Sabbath day came almost the whole city together to hear the word of Yahweh. So the whole city turns out on the Sabbath day. Let's go to Acts chapter 17. And verse 2 says, and Paul, as his manner was, went in unto them, and 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them out of the Scriptures. So here again, we see Paul, it was his custom to keep the Sabbath and to go to the synagogue on the Sabbath. Let's look at one more in the book of Acts. Acts 18:4. Says, and he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. Here again, Paul, on the Sabbath day, going to the synagogue and teaching and reasoning with the Jews and the Greeks. Now, if Paul had done exactly what the majority of churchianity has accused him of doing, I've even had a man call me this week and talk about how that Paul was a Christian, and Paul said he was a Christian. Paul never claimed to be or professed to be a Christian. All you have to do to get that thought out of your mind is to stay in the book of Acts and read about Paul and things that Paul said, if you don't want to look anywhere else but the book of Acts. But we can see that Paul had nothing to do with Sunday worship. So here we see that the believers, and we could go on and on and on, but I'm stopping here with this, and we may go deeper in another video later on this, but I just wanted to show you that even in the new covenant, even in the new assemblies, they kept the Sabbath. We could go to the book of Hebrews where it says there now remaineth a rest. That's speaking of the Sabbath day. And people will say that, well, Yeshua, Jesus, it became our Sabbath. There's nothing that backs that, or that he replaced the Sabbath. There's nothing that backs that up. There is a spiritual rest, but also a physical rest. And, Yeshua says that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. It was given for man to do exactly what we were commanded to do, and that is to stop all of our labors. One thing that I teach at the Potter's House is, it is a time to stop your physical labor, but it's also a time to set down those things that have worried you, those things that have plagued you, those things that have concerned you all week long. The Sabbath is the time to set those things down. Quit worrying about it. Quit struggling with it. Put it in the hands of Yahweh and let him take care of it, because this is the time that you enter into his presence. You're there to be with him and to worship him and to allow him to work in your life. And if we will do those things, he will take care of what we have placed in his care. We are given that promise. Now, there are those that have absolutely nothing to do with Sunday worship. And I told a person this week that is studying the Sabbath and everything, and she's curious about the Sabbath and wants to do the Sabbath, and the Lord is going to reveal the Sabbath to her. But I said, people can have church on Sunday, and you may argue with this point, and this is not an art. Do not want to start a debate, but a person can go to church on Sunday and worship Yahweh, but that's not the day he said that he was going to show up. It's kind of like this. On the Sabbath day, he says, I'm going to be there on the Sabbath day. You choose to worship him on Sunday, which this is a whole nother teaching in itself, but you choose to worship him on Sunday. If he shows up on Sunday, he just happened to be passing by. He just happened to hear his name. But he doesn't promise. He does not promise that he's going to show up on another day except on the Sabbath day. That's his appointed time. So the question is, and there's plenty more scriptures we could look at, but we promise to keep these videos short. So that's what we're going to try to do, is keep them short. But now there's one more scripture that I want to look at as we close out this video. Because we are aware or know that we're going to be keeping the Sabbath during the millennial reign. Let's go to Isaiah 66. In verse 22 says, For as the new heavens and the new earth which I will make shall remain before me, saith the Lord, so shall your seed and your name remain. And it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith Yahweh. So the question is this: why would you not go ahead and keep and do Sabbath now, when we're going to be keeping it through the millennial reign, and worshiping and coming together? And convocation is a rehearsal. It's and that's what we're told it is to be in Leviticus 23. We're to keep it as a holy convocation, a separated rehearsal. Why would you not want to go ahead and do that when you're going to be doing it in the kingdom? It only makes sense. Why not practice it now so you'll know what is going on in the kingdom? And then Zechariah even tells us that we're going to be keeping tabernacles. And if we don't, those nations that don't will receive no rain. Here again, a holy convocation. We'll talk about that as we'll get to that one. But these are just fingerprints of Yahweh. Fingerprints that these things belong to him. These are his. They're his. Why not go ahead and do them? So we're going to end this video here, this teaching here. I hope that this helps you some with your understanding. Hope that you can use this to share with others. And like I said, this is not an extensive, exhaustive teaching on the subject. This is just kind of an introduction, a teaser, maybe, to get someone more interested to do their own study. We will be having our Sabbath service this coming Sabbath, and we'll be posting that as we always do. And until then, we'll say Shabbat Shalom.